Tēnā koutou katoa, kei te mana whenua tēnā rohi, nai te rua hiki hiki ki ta mutu. No rakiora hoho, he Pākehā hoho, ko Angus McIntosh tāka ingoa, kei te mihi ki a koutou. No reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Great to see everyone. Thanks very much for the invitation to Sunny and from Sunny and the team. I'm on a mission, a bit like Naomi, to convince you to care about what goes on in the water more. Don't know whether I told you that was the pretext, but anyway, I'm here now, so you can't get rid of me. So I want to talk about these connections between the physical river, like rocks and water and stuff, and the biota, both including birds, fish, and invertebrates. So I'm going to talk about the energy base of the food web, fish populations and communities, and then the connections to physical drivers. This work is funded by Fish Futures, it's an Endeavour program, and I'm indebted to lots of colleagues who've been involved in this work, especially lots of students. I'm going to talk particularly about the river that we've been working on the most, Te Awa-a-Takatamira, which you might know as a Cass River, but named after an important chief. And we've been working on this river because it's largely intact and because it's feasible. Like it's only, a couple of kilometres across, 35 kilometres long, not 5 kilometres across or 10 kilometres across, which makes it, vaguely tractable. Although I'm sorry, we lost lots of your loggers, Naomi. So when you look at it, empties into Lake Takapō, through the delta down the bottom there with a very wide braid plain after going through a gorge, and starts right up at glacial effect on the main divide. It's amazing. We also appreciate the access given by Glenmore Station here. I should say this is the rohe of three iwi and tamana huna here, and we've been working particularly with Ara Whenua and our environmental consulting who are advising us and helping us here. Actually, so before I show you a picture of the fish, how did I get there? So once you get up to the top, it's quite steep, but the majority of the river throughout sort of 30 kilometres is still steep, but it has this relatively wide braid plain form. First thing I want to point out is that there is actually a huge biomass of fish which are linked to the lake. These are Kōaro, which migrate in out of the lake. And I'll temper huge soon, and they're particularly important for underpinning the food web of the river. This is Holly Harris, who really started this off. Tara Murray and Richard Maloney convinced us that this was a great river to work on. Holly started doing her PhD here and started collecting these data. Liam Taylor has carried on, and so we're now up to about nearly 4 years of data on movements of Kōaro out of the lake into the river. Okay, and so the biomass there on that y-axis is grams per metre squared, and probably the thing that you need to know is like a little Kōaro, one of the little ones is half a gram or getting up to 1 gram or something like that. So even these are what we call O plus fish, so small fish. Even those numbers, that's a lot of fish. That's a lot of fish energy sitting in that river per metre squared, but it fluctuates a lot. And you can see the seasons there over these years, and if you squint a bit, you can see that the blue points are all high, and we'd actually have a perfect seasonal cycle if it wasn't for this point here being high. So basically, you following me? Or are you skeptical? Okay, anyway, so they move out of the lake in the autumn, and so they're relatively high in the winter. And then some things happen. This is 0 plus fish, so small fish, so they grow and they're not small anymore, so they disappear, and so numbers of those sizes of fish are relatively small in spring and summer, except in February 2024 when something happened. Talk about that in a second. Something different happened. This is Liam, who's been working on this, and he's made this cool graph. I'm going to explain it to you. This is fish length here, and so you start up with those small fish, and these are all the times. Each line of these is a point in data. And man, Some of these data were hard fought, hard won, because that river is beeping cold in the middle of June. And I have been there, and that's the coldest I've ever been on any fieldwork I have ever done. So black bits are basically fish, and the white bits are where there's not so many fish, those sort of negative fish. They're kind of a way of this is a fisheries cohort model. And what it's trying to do is organise the data so that you can see a cohort of fish going through. And so the white bars going down are basically where there are no fish, and the black bars are where we've got lots of fish of that size. So if you start off where we first started here, these fish, when we first sampled, there were fish on the cohort that had just gone into the river, which were just over 40 millimetres, and then they go through, and by the time we got to 2024, they were up to about 80 millimetres. See what I mean? Okay, and the steep parts of the line where there's the most slope is where they're growing the fastest. Okay, and so they grow fastest during summer, that makes sense, right? And once they get up to 100 millimetres, they don't grow very much. They spawn and do fishy things that involve reproduction, mostly. Okay, here's that weird, and you can see that the model, the red lines, is trying to match up where the cohorts are going and what's happening with them. And this is pretty much the standard technique for managing fisheries, whether it be snapper or orange roughy or whatever. We try to figure out what's happening to the cohorts and where they're going and how they're developing. And there's a whole bunch of fish that turn up in the river that we were not expecting, that the model is not expecting in February 2024. So what the heck happened in the lake in the preceding period, I'm not sure, but there's some things, we've got a pretty regular cycle, and then suddenly a whole bunch of fish come out of the lake that we weren't expecting. So we're working on that. That's kind of a mystery. We want to know what the temperatures were, what the lake level fluctuations were, what was going on in the river, those sorts of things. But it's pretty interesting because these fish underpin lots of the river food web. They're transferring energy out of the river, out of the lake into the river, right? Because it's a whitebait stage, right? In this case, they're not migrating to the sea. They're using the lake as a rearing habitat, and they're growing up, but transferring lake energy into the river. So it's a spatial transfer of energy, and the terns, black-fronted terns, right, are using that. And so when you look at the total biomass of fish, it sort of reflects those patterns in recruitment into the river, but it mostly reflects dynamics with flooding. And so there was a very flooded spring in 2002, and so we had the lowest numbers of fish in the river in February 2023. And the crew have just come back. I didn't go. It was very cold. They delayed the field trip twice this winter because there's been a lot of snow in Te Awa-a-Takatamira. Couldn't even get to the field station for some of it. But there was a lot of fish. I think in 4 transects going across, sampling every braid, they caught over 700 fish in those sites, which is more than we've ever caught. 36 grams per metre squared, that's something like 5 or 6 fish per metre squared. That's a lot of fish. So it'll be very interesting to see whether that means you get lots of terns this spring, and if those fish are still there by the time we get to summer. I'm seriously interested in that because, 4 data points doesn't make a regression, but the relationship between fish food supply and tern numbers is something I think we need to be working on. Holly did a whole bunch of work with stable isotopes, looking at bleeding terns, both adults and chicks, to work out what their diet was. And these models pretty much apportion that out. And you can see that the terns are getting about 50% of their diet from the aquatic realm, according to those stable isotope data. A bunch of it's also coming from spiders. I'm going to talk about them soon. So the fish are pretty important, and they carry them around in mating displays and all those sorts of things that I'm sure you know a lot more about than me. The spiders, sorry, I didn't give any warnings for any spider phobes in the audience, but this is a wolf spider which inhabit the gravel. The spiders are still getting 50% of their food from the aquatic food web. You might think about why that's happening and how that's happening. So basically what's happening is stream insects are hatching out, emerging out of the aquatic system, moving into the terrestrial realm, and the spiders are eating them then, or they're going into the aquatic realm and eating them there. So you see where I'm going with this, right? Last time I was here, it was suggested that banded dotterels weren't eating aquatic food and that they were terrestrial. And I think when you go around and see what they're eating, they're mostly eating, you see them eating terrestrial things that are flying around, but a very large proportion of that is also coming from the water, because they're the adult stages of aquatic insects which have moved out into the terrestrial environment. So that aquatic food supply is really important, particularly for banded dotterel chicks, who more than 50% of their energy is coming from the aquatic realm. So when you look at a braided river like this, these are some of the aerial images that Holly collected, and you sit back and look at this, all of you will see different things. Here, hopefully you can see channel movement, right? There's lots of channels have been moving around. What else do you see? Yeah, different vegetations. The vegetation's moving a lot. There's not a lot of weeds, and there are some weeds in here, but compared to lots of rivers, there's not. You know, what I really want to point out is that an amazing thing about braided rivers is there's a huge amount of edge between an aquatic ecosystem and a terrestrial ecosystem. You know, they're dominated by edge, and you know the ratio of edge to the amount of water is greater than any other sort of aquatic ecosystem, and that amount of edge creates all of that potential for exchange between terrestrial and aquatic. So they're very connected ecosystems. And if you have a look, did you have any of your loggers in here, Naomi? I think at this stage, anyway, can't even see where she is now. But if you have a look over here, you know, like these orange bits, and man, I'd love to be able to pick these up with satellites and those sorts of things. They're diatom lawns. You know, the river is going off. That is food. It's really nutritious, lipid-rich food for invertebrates. And there are times in the river when it's just absolutely blooming. A lot of them are, quite often that happens in September and October, before a lot of melt's happening, but the river has cleared, the temperature has warmed up and it's very sunny. And you get these minor braids which are very shallow and wide, and they just, there's just enormous amounts of photosynthesis going there. And, you know, I've sampled a lot of rivers in my life, especially with electric fishing. And, you know, when you're electric fishing, you get lots of mayflies coming in there. I can easily say that the most amount of mayflies that I've ever seen in an electric fishing net is in this river. And a lot of people would say, you know, braided rivers are very flood prone, you know, they're low productivity, there's not a lot of energy there. That's only some of the time. You know, it really depends, and it really depends which channel you go into. A lot of the time, and particularly in spring, they are going off. So, you know, aquatic resources fuel braided river food webs, and it's facilitated by that cross-ecosystem exchange, not an AI-generated photograph. It's one of mine. Just saying. Although I could have taken out the band with AI, but I didn't. Took a long time to get this photograph also because despite what Richard and others told me, I was like skeptical about whether kaki, how much time they actually spend in the flow. But once you spend quite a lot of time on the river, they're absolutely at home there, and they are using this, and so it's amazing to see them, you know, in that environment and using that food. And if I understand things correctly, quite a lot of that is probably happening at night as well. It's a big river, and so there's been an epic amount of fieldwork over the last 2 summers to do transect sampling the entire length of it. 37 kilometres of river, 16 transects, 174 sites, and lots of students involved in this. I'll particularly point out Olivia Reynolds here, who coordinated the fieldwork in last summer, and Rory Lennox, who did it the summer before that. So with that sampling that Olivia is using for her MSc, we've got a pretty good handle on the distribution of fish populations longitudinally across the river. I know there's a lot going on this graph, but you'll cope. The first thing is that no tuna. You know, we have sampled the heck out of this river. Not a single eel has been caught in 5 years of sampling. That's a reflection of all the obstacles downstream, and we would absolutely expect them to be there. So, you know, a critical part, or, you know, a really important part of the food web in every other river in New Zealand that's not behind a whole bunch of dams is missing. So, you know, there's something to fix there. These plots are of the 4 main species in the river, distance from the lake, so from the delta up to the headwaters, and biomass on a log scale. There's a lot of zeros, so you don't catch. So each data point is a sample, a push net sample of an electrofishing net. So there's a lot of zeros in here, and we're still working out how to model this. There are 3 things I want to point out here, though. First thing is trout, brown trout, non-native. In 2024 did not make it past 15 kilometres upstream. And in 2025, we didn't detect them beyond 20 kilometres. So the top half of the river has no non-native fish in it that we've ever found. So what did I say? It has no non-native fish, no non-native fish. It's basically a native fish refuge. It's a little concerning that the distribution of trout was spreading upstream in 2025 compared to 2024. And Olivia is working on the interactions between these two, but the absence of trout is likely very important. Alpine galaxias occupy the top of the river. That's not as surprising. They're associated with colder water. Clues in the name. Kōaro, which is this migratory galaxiid that has a whitebait stage, are found throughout the river, and the biomass is pretty consistent throughout the river. There's a lot of variability, but they're absent for some reason from, not absent, but scarce in the middle part of the river a lot of the time. And there's a lot going on there with upwelling and downwelling and potentially drying reaches and those sorts of things. And so there are some physical dynamics which may be hindering some of them from getting through, and it's that gap in Kōaro distribution where we find the most upland long-jaw galaxias. And I had to laugh about the wrybill and bird of the year, but I'll just hold that thought and I'll talk about it a bit more in a second. You know where I'm going, right? The harshness of the physical environment likely constrains trout and moderates those interactions between those 3 native species. And so the physical regime, which creates lots of bed movement where it's turbid for a lot of the time, probably makes it very hard for trout to move up from the lake. They are mostly present in the springs, and they might be able to, hop through the channels and get to another spring, but they're mostly not present in the upper part of the river. And so, some change in the physical regime is likely to facilitate their passage into the river more. The harsh physical environment probably also constrains biotic interactions involving the natives as well. That the absence of Kōaro coinciding with the sort of peak occurrence of upland long-jaw galaxias probably explains, some of the reason why there's more uplands long-jaw galaxias there. And so, what better creature for bird of the year, or this is a very cool looking fish. Dean's been on national radio about these recently. Really funky. Just the sweetest face you could absolutely imagine. But they've got a big underbite, and what the hell are they using that for? And we think that's probably associated with feeding on invertebrates. I'm calling it benthic feeding in the dark. So basically, too many stories. It's turbid lots of the time. They have lots of mechanosensory systems. Having that undershot jaw probably helps them get to lots of invertebrates that they probably wouldn't otherwise get to. And those invertebrates like Deletidian mayflies are living in the Dravel, trying not to be washed away. And also, they're trying to find food. And when you really zoom in and look at what's going on there, they're feeding on lawns of diatoms and algae. And when you really get close, you can see that that's what's going on. And that's what that orange was in those aerial photographs. And the braided rivers with all of those different channel types that Naomi was talking about, really. This is what these things are trying to find. Liam he gave me these graphs this morning. Liam Taylor is doing a master's on this, and one of the things when you go and look at patterns of temperature across the transects in the river, there's always lots of variability. There's always about a 10-degree difference between channel types. So depending on what you're looking for, in terms of foraging or trying to keep your metabolism going, those conditions are there in the river, and that's part of the variability that's inherent in a braided river. Just lots of different channel types, some with upwelling cold water, some with water which is flowing over the cobbles and is heating up and is creating all of that food. And all of those channel types, this is some work that Holly did. All of those channel types, when you look at them singly, if you look at just the main braids and calculate variability in samples of invertebrates, like how many you get, that variability is really high. So there can be not very many or there can be lots. As you start adding habitats, that variability goes down and down and down until you have the complete suite of habitats, so minor braids, major braids, tributaries, mid-channel springs, side springs, they all contribute. So it's the low variability, the food supplies are really consistent. So if you're a fish, you can go somewhere in that braid plane pretty much all the time and find food. Does that make sense? Yeah, and that underpins the stability of the system. It's really important. And so, aquatic production fuels the river food web. Things like wrybill are focusing, predominantly on Deleotidia mayflies, but most of the things that are living in the river are really connected between the aquatic and terrestrial realm, and we need connected science to match. And I think we haven't often had that. We've been we've stayed in our lane. The river's biota really depends on the physical regime and the heterogeneity that's created by it. Fish Futures is a research project where we've been trying to work on that, and the end goal is trying to predict what fish communities look like in a changing climate, but also, how that'll help predict the whole river ecosystem. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the things that the physical people have been doing. Sonny's sort of nodding, yeah. He sighs a little bit. The geomorphologists like creating complicated graphs, and I'm going to explain this. They have amazing data, though. They've been flying helicopters up and down there, have centimetre level resolution from LiDAR of the elevation of the bed. So this picture on the left-hand side is the calculation of the difference in height in metres using this scale here between October 23 and April 24, for example. And if you put transects down the river, you can see this change. So some places decrease by a metre, some places have increased by a metre. And so there's lots of erosion and deposition going on. But there's a pattern here, and more of it is going on down the bottom of the river. There's also a whole lot of springs in green here, which I'm not really going to have a chance to talk about. But, first of all, channel composition could change. The river could disconnect by drying, and if you have a look here, it only needs this. We tried to do a low flow gauging. It only needs to lose like half a cubic, and the whole river would disconnect in the middle. So we'd lose a lot of river. The springs are incredibly important. This is one near Ryder Hut. There's a massive amount of water coming out of the ground, and the geomorphologists are still really struggling to figure out where that water comes from and where it goes to. They've got maps of that, but we'll talk about it later. So forecasting change really depends on us better measures of the plumbing of the system. I should stop there and thank all these people. Kia ora.